Thank you very much. And what an inspiring video we've just seen. In a minute, I'm going to talk sort of quite big picture, but I have to say, as I was listening to that video, so much of what the older adults were talking about actually is going to resonate when we look at the sort of big macro data out there. And so thank you, George, very much for the introduction. And in particular, I think the story about healthy aging has been influenced by COVID, and I'm going to introduce some of the data around that. If my slides can go up, because I can't actually see at the moment. And I need, that's it. So George asked if I would talk about what's happening with population aging. And he also asked if I would then look at some of the implications, particularly in the light of COVID. So this is going to be a very sort of, big data picture. But as I say, I think you're going to find it resonates with what George said at the beginning, with that wonderful talk we had about Manchester and the things they're doing, and then with the video. So let's look at really where we are and what we know. The first thing to say is that, I'm just going to iconize that, brilliant. The first thing we know is that aging is malleable. Healthy behaviours can prevent chronic conditions and slow down functional decline. And I really love this slide, which comes actually from the Centre on Aging at the University of Copenhagen. And they're doing a huge amount of work there with what we call cell to society, or society to cell. And what we now understand, and this has come out really, I suppose, in the last 5 years in particular, that there is a real understanding now of the way that our behaviour affects our aging process at the cellular level. So in fact, stressors, which we tend to go through later in life, in particular, retirement, bereavement, or chronic diseases, they manifest themselves at particularly the end of our lives, and they have a real impact at the cellular level. But we can be resilient to that. We know, and in fact, it was wonderful that one of your speakers from the older adults actually brought that up, didn't she? She talked about things like exercise, social networks, keeping healthy, etc. And we know that at the cellular level, that really now can slow down the aging process. So what we know is that aging is malleable, healthy behaviours are really important, and that the cellular level can control down our decline. We also know that there are differences both between generations, which we call cohort effects, and within generations. These are the socioeconomic effects. And more importantly, this becomes more pronounced as we age. And as George said, inequality really is part of the frames the story that we're about to tell. And then finally, many of the risk factors are mutually reinforcing and multiply over the life course. So I think all the evidence we have very much supports these statements. So let's look at some big picture demography. And I'm going to give you figures to start with before the pandemic, and then we can turn to look at what has the pandemic done to our understanding. So will increases in life expectancy continue? Will advances in life expectancy be matched by advances in healthy life expectancy? And importantly, do we yet know how COVID-19 has impacted upon both life expectancy and healthy life expectancy? So this is the standard UN projections, and in fact these run up to about 2018. And we just took some OECD countries, and importantly you'll see we looked at men and women over 60. And I think there's a reason now, because in most countries, most populations, most people make it to 60. In fact, in most high-income countries, half the population now lives to roughly 80. So increasingly, we're really interested in what happens to life expectancy at 60. If you look at this figure, then the solid lines are women and the dotted lines are men. And that's because in nearly every country, women outlive men. In fact, across the life course, we know that at all ages, females live longer than men. They have lower mortality and also typically lower morbidity. When we talk about COVID, I'm sure you're all aware of the story that men fared much worse than women did in COVID. And that is reflected in our understanding of disease profiles in general. And the really interesting thing here is that right at the top, we have the longest lived populations, who at the national level are Spain, Japan, and France. And then we drop quite a bit down to the UK and US. And as I said, you can see that women consistently at all ages have lower mortality rates than men, therefore higher life expectancies. And we really do understand, I think, why at the national level these countries are so successful. The interesting one is obviously France. What is it about the Channel that makes such a difference between French women and English women in particular? And when we look at this data, we see that actually it's Northern French women and English women who have the same life expectancy. And the division actually runs across France. And what we're talking about is Mediterranean French women in particular. So we know the Mediterranean diet, we know being outside, we know reducing our stress, social networks, exercise, etc. Really do promote life expectancy. So the next question is, how long do we think life expectancy increases are going to continue? We did think there was some flattening in 2015, but in actual fact, what we're now beginning to realize that in those countries where there was a particular flattening in life expectancy, and that was particularly in the US and the UK, a lot of that was probably due to inequality in the population. And if we take that inequality out, then definitely high income, well-educated men and women continued their life expectancy increases. And how long is this going to go on for? This was a very influential paper that came out in the Lancet, and we're looking at the longest lived countries. And if we zoom in here, we can see right at the top is South Korea, and then we have France, Japan, and Spain. And that projection is that in 10 years' time, baby girls will have a life expectancy at birth of over 90. And that's the first country in the world to reach that. We can also look at another study also published in the Lancet using different modeling, different data, and it came up with a very similar picture. And many of you were probably aware that the projections are that half the baby girls born in most high-income countries will probably potentially live to a century. And we can see here, if you look right at the top, we have Japan, and what that projection said was that half of the babies that were born in 2007 by this particular modeling were going to make it to 107. And you can see that France, the UK, and Italy come in at about, I think it's France and Italy come in at 104, and the UK comes in at 103. So we were very positive prior to the pandemic about the increases of life expectancy, particularly at the national level. What about healthy life expectancy? The really, really big question until the pandemic was around obesity. We knew that obesity in high-income countries was really threatening life expectancy, and we can very quickly look at some data on that. We know that a higher BMI is associated with all sorts of diseases. This just shows the risk factors for vascular disease and how they go up considerably as your weight increases. Similarly, higher BMI is associated with an increase in the risk of diabetes. We can do similar modeling for cancer and most of the chronic morbidities. And if you remember, what was particularly interesting was obesity was a risk factor for COVID. So I want to come back in a minute to talk a little bit more about COVID and healthy life expectancy. But let's just move on now to look at COVID in general. Before we do that, let's consider the inequality question. And George obviously is very much concerned with the way that inequality affects healthy life expectancy. And I thought I would just show you this graph. This is some work that we did in that study that George was talking about, the Foresight Review on Aging. And if you look at the sort of green, dark lines, that is life expectancy. And if you look at the light olivey lines, that is healthy life expectancy. And this is showing the life expectancy and the healthy life expectancy for men aged 65 in England by areas of deprivation. So as you're looking at it, on the left-hand side, we have the most deprived areas, and on the right-hand side, we have the least deprived areas. And what shows in this graph very, very clearly, this is from ONS data. Again, this is pre-COVID. that if you are a man aged 65 living in some of our most deprived areas, you're very likely to live till you're 80, but you're going to go into ill health in your early 70s. That means most of your 70s are going to be in ill health. If, however, you are a 65-year-old man living in our least deprived or our most affluent areas, you probably will live well into your late 80s, and you won't even go into ill health until you reach 80. So our entire 70s are very much affected by socioeconomic differences, in this case measured by areas of deprivation. What about COVID? How has COVID changed our knowledge? There has been a huge outpouring of research on the impact of COVID, particularly on life expectancy. And I'll just take you through some of those papers. This is a study that came out last year, and it looked at the impact of COVID in European countries. And basically, the darker it is, the more excess deaths were mapped. And you can see that particularly parts of Spain and Italy, they had up to a 200% increase through COVID in excess deaths. The UK was round about 100%. So what impact did that have in those years on life expectancy? I just want you to look at this study. This is a study that came out in the Journal of Epidemiology earlier this year. And just look at the right-hand graph, which is life expectancy in age 60. And let's just look at women. Women are red in this. And the way to look at it is that the line, let's look at Spain right at the top. So there is a vertical line, that was life expectancy in 2015. You can see how much life expectancy had increased over the next 4 years if you look at the cross, and then you can see the quite dramatic fallback to the round button, because the little round button is what happened in 2020. And you can see that for most countries, there was continued increases in life expectancy for women aged 60, but then that dramatic fallback. We can also look at it looking at losses and gains in life expectancy from birth. And again, in this picture, let's look at the blue, which are men. And again, the way that you look at that is that this is gains or actually losses in life expectancy. The ones that are dark, that is due to COVID, and the ones that are sort of slightly shaded, that's due to other causes. And if we look at the US, let's just take the US, and we can see that during COVID, the years of COVID, this is in 2020, the paper was published in 2022, you can see that in the US, they still had, if you like, excess deaths or changes to life expectancy right at the top, which were caused by other issues. But look at the tremendous increase, about 2 years that was lost due to COVID at birth. And I think it's important that we look at birth in this particular case, because of course, although older adults were mainly affected, it was quite an unusual pandemic. Often with a pandemic, it's younger people and babies and children who are affected. But in this particular case, COVID-19 particularly affected older adults. We also know that there was loss across the life course. And we also know that across that life course, men, as I said, were more vulnerable than women. Certain ethnic groups seemed to be more vulnerable, and poverty, poorer people were more vulnerable. So the thing that we definitely saw with COVID is that it really highlighted death across the life course, morbidity across the life course, healthy lives or lack of healthy lives, very much being affected by inequality and being male, of an ethnic minority status, and poor in most countries made you particularly vulnerable. Here we have just the life expectancy in England and what happened. And I've put men on one side. These are Public Health England figures for 2021. And I've put women on the other side. And what I've done is I've adjusted it for the ages so that you can see that women, their life expectancy did go down, but they were at much older ages. There was roughly a 5-year difference between men and women when we look at that data. And you can see particularly early in 2020, dramatic drop. That is the gold line between 2019 and 2020, how there was this real drop between January and June in life expectancy. But you can see again that women were much older when they lost those lives. And I think there's a really big, interesting piece about age discrimination and shielding, because of course there was a sort of a blanket, anyone over 70 is vulnerable. Well, actually the risk factor for women who were age 70, they had a 5-year less risk factor, and so basically it should have been 70 for men and 75 for women statistically, although they were taken together in terms of advice race shielding. But there is good news, and I wanted to show you this graph. If you look at the red line, so here we have a variety of countries here. This recently came out in Nature just a few months ago. And if you look at the red lines, that was the negative change in losses in life expectancy for all countries. But when you start looking at the grey lines, you see how quickly in 2021 there was a turnaround. So right in the middle, we have England and Wales. That is the first of those grey lines to turn back. And you can see already by 2021, life expectancy declines were falling, and in many cases, life expectancy was beginning to go back. And in fact, I think Belgium, Switzerland, Sweden, they had returned by the end of 2021 back to where they would have been if we hadn't had COVID. So at the national level, life expectancy took a hit, but it very, very quickly changed and came back. And that's a really interesting story, which we'll pick up in a few minutes at the end. Now, George said, could I just look at what would be the impact of these changes in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy? And I think the really important thing, these figures are not really robust enough at the moment to really reflect at the national level on the impact of long COVID. However, if we look at specific diseases, we know that there has been an increase in chronic conditions which appear to be associated with COVID. And we also know, sadly, that even those people who were not hospitalized with COVID, that certain chronic conditions, particularly actually for younger people as well as older people, seem to be on the increase and are possibly linked to COVID. So, for example, if we look at some of the sort of cardiac impact, already we're picking up that particularly younger men who had COVID appear to have an increased risk of getting certain cardiac complaints, whether COVID caused it, whether there was an underlying condition and COVID exacerbated it, we're not sure. But if we look at specific disease profiles, that seems to be coming out. And that obviously is going to have a huge impact going forward if we have more chronic comorbidity in our population, and particularly among older people, because one of the things that we had been moving towards was increasing the number of people over 60, over retirement or state pension age, who were staying in our workforces. And if we have higher chronic comorbidities or ill health in that population, that is going to have some kind of an impact. So I'm very quickly going to look at what will the economic impact potentially be, and then what will the health impact be, just with a couple of slides. So one of the reasons why this is important, this is an old slide. This slide was actually produced about 10 years ago, and it uses OECD data. And the reason it is important is that what it's showing here is looking at OECD countries, and it's looking at the blue line. So we're going basically across the century. And the blue line is the number of people entering the labour force. In other words, by this particular measure, those aged 20 to 24. And those people naturally leaving the labour force. And by this particular measure, it's 60 to 64. And you can see the projection was that in 2017, there would be more people retiring than there would be entering the labour force. Now, there are lots of caveats here, because obviously people enter the labour force before they're 20, and they definitely work on later than 65. But this was just the sort of general view that was taken in this particular study. And it actually came true. Around about 2017, we started to get the huge skill shortage that we are now seeing in nearly all high-income countries. And so retaining older adults who would like to stay in the labour force is actually going to be very important. And of course, COVID and potentially the cost of living crisis, which has to a certain extent come out of COVID, but also has come out of obviously the war in Ukraine, has had a massive impact. So people have talked a lot about the idea of a pandemic-led great retirement. These are some American figures, and they just look at the 18 months between January 2020 to September 2021. If you look at the blue line, that's people 55 to 64 in the States who were potentially coming up to retirement, whether they stayed or whether they left. So those above the 0% is an increase in those leaving, and then we have a decrease. And you can see that actually for that age group, there's no true narrative at all. If we look at the red line, that's people over 75, a slight increase, which would be expected. But look at the 65 to 74-year-olds. By this particular data set, there does seem to be quite significant evidence that by the end of last year, we had about a 12% increase in that group, 65 to 74, who one would hope, if they were healthy, might wish to have stayed in the labour market and yet were withdrawing. And we can look at this data similarly from America. And this is the percentage of retirees in the US, and then looking at what they call the baby boom retirement trend and how they think the pandemic has affected it. And so the way you read this is the blue line goes from January 1995 up to January 2020. And you can see very clearly that there was a steady increase in retirement among this group. But if you then look at the red line is what they call the baby boomer trend. In other words, we know that there were people coming up to retirement age, and that's why we had so many people of that age leaving the labour market. It was a demographic trend. And the red line shows what would have happened if the trend had continued, but the real reality was the blue line, and the argument there shows that actually the demographic line, which should have predicted retirement, has been distorted by a real withdrawal of people in the States who are leaving the labour market. How much that is a desire to change work-life balance, how much that is around health, potentially weakening health due to the pandemic, is unclear. But I think the evidence is that we do seem to have a withdrawal of particularly people in their late 60s from the labour market, which wasn't expected, particularly in the US. What about care? What about the impact on care? And I'm just going to show you some slides pre-pandemic. This is a wonderful study by Kingston, which was published in The Lancet. And if you just look at that column, they projected a total increase from 2015 to 2035 in terms of dependency. So this is before the pandemic. And they suggested that while independent people would rise to 41%, there was going to be a massive increase, a 61.5% increase in those people with high dependency. And that was due to the sheer number of older adults who were still going to be around. So the picture already at the national level in the UK was beginning to look slightly concerning. We can see this very clear here. Again, this also is a study that came out in 2017. And what this is showing is that, again, due to the sheer number of older adults who are surviving, we are going to get an increase in disability, even if the prevalence of disease goes down. And so what you need to look at is if you look at B, that's to the right, that is men and women, and you can see that even if the prevalence of disease within our population stayed stable, just because of the sheer numbers. When you look at A, the number of cases of people by this particular unable to carry out one or more ADL was going to go up. And returning to the inequality story, this is a wonderful graph, again published pre-pandemic. And the way you have to look at that, this is crude incidence of heart failure. And right at the bottom, in the pale blue, these are people living in the least deprived areas of, I think this is the UK. And right at the top with the dark, this is the most deprived people. And you can see consistently people with heart failure have tended to be far more predominant if you're in a most deprived area than if you're in a least deprived area. So much so that we could reduce heart failure by 18% if we were able to bring everybody down to more affluent populations. So let's conclude by saying, do we have any evidence at all of how COVID is going to change healthy life expectancy? And this is a really interesting paper because at the moment we just simply don't have the data at the population level. We have it by individual diseases coming through, but not at the population level. So the way you read this is 2020 to 2021. And what they have done is the red are the years lost to COVID. But the grey are people who survived, but they stayed in a disabled state. And you can see that as the pandemic progressed, the years lost went down, but the grey increased, so that by the end of 2021, we're between 14 and 16% increase of years in disabled status due to COVID. So how do we put all this together? And I just, strangely you might say, want to go back historically to look at this. This is looking at the last pandemic. These figures are looking at the changes of life expectancy in birth between 1841 and 2009. And we've got male at the bottom and female at the top. Same story, women have higher life expectancy. But let's look at that real dip right in the middle, the V. That was basically the last pandemic, when it really knocked out populations. Obviously, to a certain extent, we did also have the First World War in there. But can you see how quickly life expectancy bounced back? It was mainly young people, children who were affected by the pandemic. And the life expectancy very quickly bounced back. Now, the argument is that here we have a very straight V, but remember, very little of that life expectancy was due to our healthcare systems. It was mainly just public health initiatives at the beginning of the 20th century. We're so reliant on our healthcare systems. We know in most high-income countries, COVID really put pressure on them. We know in this country, there's lack of screening for things like cancer, cardio disease, etc. And so the argument is actually the recovery from COVID is going to be far longer, and that V is really, really going to open up. So the story vis-a-vis health expectancy is probably unknown, but may well not be, sadly, that positive. Thank you very much.
Sarah, thank you. You once again, you sort of filled our minds with some fabulous facts and insight into demographics and pandemic. And sadly, I know we're sort of running out of time to sort of pose many questions. I did get just one, just very quickly. And that's because I think there's an interesting angle here. A question about life expectancy and what happened in the USA and the negative impact that you were showing on non-COVID cases. And if you understand, or do you know what was behind that, and are there implications actually for us in the UK?
I mean, I think potentially, yes. As you know, there's been some very interesting studies around, basically around debt prison and particularly midlife mortality. And I think the story in the UK is very similar, maybe not as dramatic, and in fact, those think that it didn't be as dramatic. And that's that if we look at life expectancy pre-pandemic, we know that, as I said, that for both men and women in particular, in affluent areas or of a high socioeconomic status, their life expectancy was still increasing. However, if we look at what was happening among our poorer population, those people living in the most deprived areas, men was actually flattening and women was falling. And the impact was so great that seemed to have affected the national figures in so much as it was really dragging down the national figures. So both in the States and here, as you said, George, right at the beginning, it's in life expectancy and inequality in the lives that we are leading, which I think is partly responsible for that kind of increase in basically morbidity across the life course among particular groups, both in the US and here.
Sarah, thank you very much. And I'm sure we could go on all morning asking you questions from that, but I'm going to move us on. So thank you very much for everything you've done to get the challenge up and running and for a fascinating talk.